One life changed eternity. Welcome to Justice and Glory. Together.
Back to the question. So back to where we began. Was the trial of Jesus the most illegal trial in history? The honest answer is that the question itself may be the wrong one. The image of a perfect legal code, cynically shattered point by point in a single night, turns out to rest largely on a rule book written generations later, applied to a court that may never have been bound by it in a proceeding that may not even have been a formal trial. Strip away that later frame, and something more human and more disturbing comes into view. What we are really watching is not a courtroom, it is a collision, a temple aristocracy with everything to lose if a Passover crowd turned into a riot. A Roman prefect, brutal and politically exposed, who cared nothing for Jewish theology, but a great deal about order and about Caesar. A festival city packed and volatile, and at the center, a prisoner whose answer to a single question forced every hand around him. Religion, politics, and imperial power, pressing on one man in the space of a few hours. The tragedy of the trial was never that a tidy list of statutes was broken. It was that, in the meeting of fear, power, and expedience, the question of what was actually just got lost entirely. That is a far older story than any legal code, and it is a story that did not end in the first century. That is why this night still holds us, believer and skeptic alike. For Christians, these hours sit at the very center of their faith, the moment when, as they have long understood it, an innocent man was condemned so that others might go free. For the historian, it is a rare and vivid window into how justice actually worked and failed at the seam where a small nation met a vast empire. And for anyone who has ever watched the powerful protect themselves, watched a crowd swept up in a moment, watched the truth become inconvenient, the trial of Jesus is uncomfortably familiar. We may never reconstruct that night to the minute. The sources are too old and too few, and the people who wrote them cared less about legal transcript than about meaning. But perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside the question of legality. A trial can follow every rule and still be unjust, and a single night 2,000 years ago still asks us what we would have done if we had been standing in that courtyard, in the dark, when the truth became dangerous. In the next episode, we will follow what happened when that Roman sentence was carried out, and ask what the earliest evidence, in text and in stone, can and cannot tell us about the morning they said the tomb was empty. John alone records the exact spot where Pilate passed sentence. He calls it the stone pavement and gives its local name, Gabbatha, meaning something like the raised place. A Roman governor speaking judgment from an elevated platform of stone is just what we would expect, and excavations of the palace of Herod and the paved courtyards of Jerusalem are consistent with that picture, though scholars still debate the exact location. And there is one find that makes the ending almost unbearably real. For all the thousands crucified by Rome, physical remains almost never survive. But in 1968, in a tomb on the northern edge of Jerusalem, archaeologists found the heel bone of a young man named Yehohanan, with an iron nail still driven through it, bent against a knot in the wood. It remains one of the only pieces of direct archaeological evidence for crucifixion ever recovered. It does not tell us about Jesus, but it illuminates, in bone and iron, exactly what the word crucifixion meant. So where does all of this leave the great question? Was it a legal trial or not? Here, the honest answer is that scholars genuinely disagree, and the disagreement is illuminating. One influential line of thought argues that the night meeting was never meant to be a formal capital trial at all. On this reading, what happened in the house of the high priest was a preliminary hearing, an inquiry to decide what charge to bring before Pilate in the morning. If that is right, then measuring it against the trial rules of the Mishnah is beside the point, because it was not that kind of proceeding. Darrell Bach and others have made this case in detail. Other scholars are more skeptical. Raymond Brown, whose 2-volume study remains the most thorough treatment of these events, regarded a formal night trial as historically problematic and thought the gospel writers may have shaped the scene for their own purposes. More recently, some researchers have argued the opposite, noting that certain details in the Gospel accounts line up surprisingly well with procedures preserved in the later Jewish sources, which might mean those sources reach back further than we assumed. Notice what is happening. We began with a confident list of illegal steps, and we have arrived at a room full of careful historians who cannot fully agree on what kind of event they are even looking at. That is not a failure. It is what honest history looks like when the sources are ancient, partial, and written by people with deep convictions. And it should make us cautious about any retelling that counts the broken laws with perfect certainty. There's one more reason to handle this story with care, and it is the most serious of all. For much of Christian history, the account of this trial was turned into a weapon because the Gospels describe Jewish authorities pressing for the death of Jesus. Later generations drew a conclusion the texts do not support. They blamed the Jewish people as a whole and across all time for the death of Jesus, and gave that blame a terrible name: deicide, the killing of God. That charge fueled centuries of persecution, expulsion, and violence, and it echoed into the horrors of the 20th century. It is one of the darkest threads in the history of the West. Modern historians, and notably the churches themselves, have firmly rejected that reading. In 1965, the Catholic Church declared in the document Nostra Aetate that what happened in the Passion of Jesus cannot be charged against all Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. The historical reality is narrower and clearer than the ancient slander. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment for a political crime. The sentence was the decision of Pilate. The people involved were a small circle of the temple aristocracy and a Roman governor managing a restless city at Passover. Not a nation, and certainly not a people for all time. Many scholars add a further observation. The Gospels were written decades after the events, in years when the followers of Jesus were increasingly at odds with the wider Jewish community and living under Roman power. A number of historians argue that this context shaped the way responsibility was portrayed, with the Roman governor drawn ever more sympathetically and the Jewish leadership pushed toward the center of the blame. That is a scholarly reading, not a certainty, but it is one more reason to read the trial as history, with all its politics, rather than as a simple verdict on anyone. Now notice something that the later law makes strange. That same Mishnah defines the crime of blasphemy very narrowly. By its rule, a man is not guilty of blasphemy unless he actually pronounces the sacred name of God, the name too holy to speak. And in the account of Mark, Jesus does not do that. He uses a reverent substitute. He says, power, standing in for God, exactly as a devout Jew of his time would. By the strict letter of that later definition, his words would not qualify. So how could the priests condemn him? Here is where scholars have done careful work. A significant number of researchers, among them Darrell Bock, argue that the narrow definition in the Mishnah was probably not the only one in circulation in the 1st century. The Sadducean priests likely understood blasphemy more broadly as any speech that dishonored God, including a human being claiming to share the throne of God and ride the clouds of heaven, images drawn straight from the Hebrew scriptures and reserved for God alone. From their vantage point, a man placing himself at the right hand of the Almighty was not simply mistaken. He was assaulting the holiness of God. The point is not to decide whether they were right. It is to see that even the central charge is more tangled than a broken rule. It rests on a real disagreement about what blasphemy even was. Before the Roman governor, dawn. And that leads to the strangest turn of all. If the council had already judged Jesus worthy of death, why did they not carry out the sentence themselves? Why hand him to Rome at all? The Gospel of John gives the answer in a single line. When Pilate tells the council to judge Jesus by their own law, they reply that they are not permitted to put anyone to death. Under Roman rule, the power of execution, what the Romans called the right of the sword, belonged to the governor. This is the majority view among historians, and it explains the whole handoff. A religious charge of blasphemy meant little to a Roman official, so before Pilate, The accusation transformed. It was no longer about the honor of God. It was about Caesar. Jesus was presented as a man who claimed to be a king, the king of the Jews, a direct challenge to Roman authority. Blasphemy would not move a governor. Sedition would. There is a genuine debate here worth naming. A minority of scholars point out that the council did sometimes carry out executions. The book of Acts describes the stoning of Stephen. Josephus records that years later, in a gap between Roman governors, the high priest convened the council and had James, the brother of Jesus, stoned to death, and was removed from office for overstepping. But notice that killing happened precisely when no governor was present, and it cost the high priest his position. The exception seems to prove the rule. In normal times, a capital sentence needed Rome. The rest of the scene follows that logic. Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and a prisoner named Barabbas. He asks whether he should crucify their king. And in the account of John, the chief priests answer with a line heavy with irony for a people longing to be free of Rome. "We have no king but Caesar." Whatever happened in the house of the high priest that night, the sentence that ended the life of Jesus was a Roman one for a Roman crime carried out by Roman hands. The stone pavement. The ground itself has begun to fill in this world. Not to prove what happened in any single moment, but to show us the stage on which it happened. We have already met the Pilate stone from Caesarea, which confirms that a Pontius Pilate governed Judea with the title the Gospels imply. There is more. In 1990, workers south of Jerusalem accidentally broke into a burial cave, and inside they found an ornate limestone bone box, carved twice with a name in Aramaic, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Many scholars believe this is the family tomb, and, quite possibly, the very bone box of the high priest who questioned Jesus, the same Caiaphas named by Josephus as high priest through those years. The identification is probable, rather than certain, but it corroborates that a high priest of that exact name and family existed, precisely where and when the Gospels place him. The house of the high priest. The middle of the night. Now to the heart of it. Where does the famous list of broken laws actually come from? Open almost any book or sermon on the subject, and you will find the violations laid out with confidence. The trial was held at night, when capital cases were supposed to be tried only by day. It was held on the eve of a festival, when such trials were forbidden. A guilty verdict was reached the same day it began, when the law required judges to sleep on a death sentence and confirm it only the following day. The court sought witnesses against the accused, and when their testimony did not agree, the case should have collapsed. It met in the private residence of the high priest, rather than the appointed hall on the Temple Mount. And in the end, when the witnesses failed, the high priest turned to Jesus himself and pressed him to speak, which looks like forcing a man to condemn himself out of his own mouth. Laid side by side, it is a devastating indictment. If every one of those rules was in force that night, then the trial was not merely unfair, it was a mockery of the law from beginning to end. But here is the reversal. Almost every rule on that list comes from a single source, and that source is a document called the Mishnah, a written collection of Jewish law that was not compiled until around the year 200, more than 170 years after Jesus stood before the council. To understand why that matters, we have to ask a question that changes everything about the list. Were these rules the law in the year 30, or are we reading a later world back into an earlier night? The Mishnah is one of the treasures of Jewish tradition. It preserves the debates and rulings of generations of rabbis. But it was written down long after the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70, and it reflects, in large part, the ideals of the rabbinic movement that grew out of the Pharisees. The court it describes, with its careful protections for the accused, is in many ways a portrait of how later sages believed a righteous court should function. The council that questioned Jesus was a different body in a different world. In the year 30, the Jerusalem council was dominated not by the Pharisees, but by the priestly aristocracy, the Sadducees, working under the watchful eye of Rome. Whether they followed the exact procedures later written in the Mishnah is genuinely uncertain. Some of those rules may not have existed yet. Others may have been Pharisaic ideals that the Sadducean priesthood did not share. This is the anachronism problem, and serious historians take it seriously. To say the trial broke the rules of the Mishnah is a little like judging a trial from the year 1850 by a law passed in the year 2020. The later code may preserve older customs. It may not. We simply cannot assume that every protection a rabbi wrote down around the year 200 was binding law in the courtyard of Caiaphas. There is even a hint of this from within the rabbinic tradition itself. A much later Jewish source recalls that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the authority to carry out death sentences had been taken away from the Jewish court. That tradition was written down centuries after the fact, and its 40 years is likely a round number rather than a stopwatch. But it points to something real. By the time of Jesus, the council no longer stood at the height of its old power. It operated inside the machinery of a Roman province. So the list of illegalities does not simply dissolve, but it stops being a checklist and becomes a question. And that question opens onto something deeper than procedure, the charge. To see it, we need the very words the people that night actually used. The council itself carried a Greek name borrowed into Hebrew and Aramaic. Sanhedrin, the root behind the word Sanhedrin, means simply a sitting together, a council in session. And the accusation that finally stuck carried its own Greek name, blasphemia, blasphemy, an insult against the honor of God. But blasphemy is exactly where the puzzle sharpens. In the account given by Mark, the oldest of the Gospels, the witnesses fail, and the high priest asks Jesus directly whether he is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed. Jesus answers that they will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. At that, the high priest tears his robes and cries blasphemy, and the council judges him worthy of death. For nearly 2,000 years, people have called it the most unjust trial in human history. A man arrested in the dark, a rushed hearing before the most powerful religious council in the land, a death sentence handed down before the sun came up. Preachers have counted the broken rules one by one until the whole night looks like a courtroom where every safeguard was thrown away on purpose. And yet, the closer historians look at that famous list of violations, the stranger it becomes. Because many of the laws said to have been broken that night were not written down until more than a century after Jesus died. Some of them may not have existed yet. And a growing number of scholars now ask a question that sounds almost like heresy against the story we inherited. Was the trial of Jesus actually illegal at all? Or is the idea of the illegal trial telling us more about the people who told the story than about what really happened in Jerusalem, that Passover? Hold that question, because to answer it, we have to walk through that night hour by hour and separate what the Gospels say from what later tradition added on top. Jerusalem, Passover, around the year 30. Start with the one thing almost no serious historian doubts. Jesus of Nazareth was executed by crucifixion in Jerusalem under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. This is not a claim that rests only on the Gospels. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around the year 116, recorded that a man he calls Christus had been put to death during the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the governor Pontius Pilate. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing around the year 93, mentioned Jesus and his execution under Pilate as well, in a passage that later Christian copyists appear to have embellished, though most scholars agree an original core stands behind it. We can even put a face on the man who signed the order. For centuries, some doubted Pilate had existed at all. Then, in 1961, archaeologists digging at Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast turned over a block of limestone that had been reused in the steps of a theater. Carved into it was a dedication, and on it, the name Pontius Pilate, with his title, Prefect of Judea. It is one of the few artifacts that directly confirms a named figure from the Gospels held exactly the office the Gospels give him. So, the death is history. The dispute is about the night before it. What exactly happened between the arrest and the cross? And was any of it against the law? The arrest After dark. Here we hit our first surprise, and it is one most retellings quietly smooth over. The four Gospels do not tell the story of the trial in exactly the same way. They agree on the shape of the night, but they differ on the details, and those differences matter. All four remember that Jesus was arrested at night in a garden across the Kidron Valley from the city, betrayed by one of his own followers. From there, the accounts begin to diverge. The Gospel of John says Jesus was taken first to Annas, the aging former high priest and father-in-law of the man who held the office that year. Only John records this first private interrogation. Matthew and Mark move straight to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where they describe a gathering of the chief priests and the council questioning Jesus through the night. Luke tells it differently again. In Luke, the real session of the council happens not at night but at daybreak. Then comes the second stage. As morning breaks, the Gospels agree. The council reaches a decision and hands Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman governor, who alone had the power to order an execution. And here, Luke adds a scene no one else includes. Pilate, learning that Jesus was a Galilean, sends him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the feast. Herod questions him, mocks him, and sends him back. This is why careful historians resist blending the four accounts into one seamless film. When we say the Gospels describe the trial, we are really describing a sequence pieced together from four voices that emphasize different moments. Keeping them separate is not a weakness in the story. It is the first clue that the night was more tangled than the tidy version suggests.